Again, the lines are open 011-542-2186 on social media at ANN7TV. That's our Twitter handle. Kim Haller is a political commentator, joins us in studio. Oliver Dixon, social political analyst. Carl Niehaus is MKMVA NEC member, and Professor Sipho Seape, political analyst. And Professor Andre Thomas Hausen is a constitutional law expert. Good evening to all our guests, and thanks so much for joining us. It does feel like deja vu. It was earlier this year with the cabinet reshuffle, where we were all speculating around the reasons why the president would have sacked certain ministers. But just looking at the reaction from the SACP, and I'll start with you, Kim, in the sense that they now claim this is provocation, almost being combative, that they need to respond to the president.
Thank you, and congratulations to all the new appointed cabinet ministers. I think there's a lot of speculation in the media at the moment, and I think we're seeing a very alarmist hysterical media and some reaction from some of the affiliates. And I think we must be careful not to politicize this move or personalize it. I think this is an issue of performance. And I think if we look at the week that we're in, it's a historically very important week as the world mourns and marks the 30th anniversary of the assassination of Thomas Sankara. And he spoke about reinventing, having the courage to reinvent the future. And I think this is exactly what President Zuma is doing in terms of the sphere of higher education. We have a minister who has not listened closely enough to the calls of the students, either on free education or on the issue of decolonizing a system of education which has never honored the black child. So I think let us be wary to make this into an unnecessary, conflictual, factional political issue when it could just be an issue of pure performance.
Yeah, but I mean, the question would be why now? Because we know that the SACP and COSATU have been tumultuous in their criticism of Jacob Zuma's leadership, spanning almost a year, if not longer. Professor Seape, why now?
Well, that's actually, Kim has brought a different dimension. We must also accept that when the president makes a decision, we expect him to look at the number of factors. And one of those will be the performance, but that will not be the only one. The other one is whether somebody is a team player. And nobody, it's only those who choose not to see or who pretend that they are not aware of the reality. The reality is that the former Minister of Higher Education, his relationship with the president had almost come to an end. And for the last year or so, he has, every time you see him taking a public posture, it is always anti the president. And when you are a president, you invite people to serve, to become part of the team in your own cabinet. And when people begin to assume a posture of opposition, when the only time they are in a public space is to call you names and even to call for your downfall, even as a leader, you have to get to a stage where you also show them that, look, you don't have monopoly in that. And this notion of the relationship and the declaration of war, I think the SACP has long declared war. And I don't hold the view that the alliance exists. What exists is simply the romance with history. The position of the alliance in the last few months has been the one that targets the ANC and the president of the ANC. So I think the president has exercised the prerogative that he has. And what Mantashe was also saying is that they've been trying to mend the relationship. And even the notion of consultation, he says, even as the ANC approaches it, must approach it much more, it must be nuanced, because the party may have its dictate, but there's also the constitutional prerogative that he exercises. But what they were saying, they were hoping that when you exercise that prerogative, you'll consult us. So this is a contradiction that has not yet been addressed between constitutionalism and party politics. And this is what Gwede was saying. But I also heard some of the media saying Gwede was slamming the decision. What I heard was Gwede simply commenting that this does not augur well for the alliance relationship that is already in tatters.
No. And just going on the media reports is also that the ANC is disappointed with the reshuffle, and we've only really heard Gwede Mantashe making his comment on that. But I just want to come back to the severing of relationships and who perhaps was the antagonist in this whole matter. The SACP making their stance clear that yes, they'll stick around, but it's purely for the people and not necessarily for Zuma. They still stand by their call for Zuma to fall. Are we then saying that the president lacks emotional maturity or intelligence to then be vindictive because so many people have been critical of his leadership?
Well, Cindy, I think the situation is that the SACP has been highly provocative. We remember what happened when they actually threatened that if their particular stance and also their particular leader for the presidency in December is not elected, that they will then threaten to remove themselves from the alliance and go it alone. So what we have seen here is them blackmailing the ANC and blackmailing everyone around it. And the president's response is, I believe, one of dealing with an issue of blackmail, but at the same time dealing with the issue of performance. And the most important thing in all of this, and we've said it in our MKMVA statement, is the importance to get radical economic transformation implemented as speedily as possible. And some of the people, and we can include with this also Dr. Bladen Zamande, had not been successful in that process of radical economic transformation, because the essence also of radical economic transformation is the transformation of our education system and the empowerment, both in terms of education, but also in terms of the fees that students are still having to pay, that President Zuma is addressing this issue. And we must congratulate him for doing this, because it is important that we move on radical economic transformation and service delivery as fast as possible. And he's doing that. He's showing his commitment to it.
All right, let's get another perspective. And we have Professor Andre Thomashausen, constitutional law expert, and Oliver Dixon, social political analyst on our soft set. Good evening, gentlemen. Just a very quick one. In terms of consultation being consensus, in a sense, it seems that the SACP is stuck on the fact that they weren't consulted, only heard from media reports that the Bladen Zamande was axed. Does consultation mean consensus to both of you?
No, I don't think so. A British Prime Minister will change his cabinet as he pleases, and he's entitled to do that. And President Zuma, constitutionally, is a Prime Minister. He has the prerogative of appointing and replacing ministers. And if ministers have been in their office for a long time without producing good results, as in the case of higher education, then there may be a time to retire them. That is a very normal process. If you are working in a coalition of parties, as is the case, then yes, of course, the leading party in the coalition will inform the minority party in the coalition. I don't know to what extent that was done, but I'm sure it was done. And in any way, the SACP would not have been able to really influence the decision that was taken. So there's nothing wrong with this decision. What we're looking at is a reshuffle that first international reactions is really mostly welcomed. Is a reshuffle where two young cadres, Professor Mkhize leading, have been given a very important responsibility to change a terrible situation where South Africa is no longer producing any patents. There is no innovation coming out of the higher education sector. The higher education sector has been dried up like a dry swamp. There's no academic capacity. I spent my life at UNISA. Bladen Zimande's recipe was to halve the number of academics and to double the number of students. And as a result, student satisfaction at UNISA fell from somewhere 90% to somewhere below 70%. And of course, the outputs are very deplorable. So this was a rational thing to do. Home affairs is a major stumbling block for industrial and economic development in South Africa. It makes it virtually impossible for succeeding companies to get critical skills. The process has been rendered something impossible. Where other countries will resolve these issues in one day, South Africa will procrastinate for months, whilst illegal immigration is not curbed. We are faced with millions of illegal immigrants in South Africa that are eating up our our infrastructure resources.
Yeah, Professor Thomas Hauser, just to hold the thought, just look at the performance appraisal of former Higher Education Minister Blade Nzimande. We just heard a response now from the Cape Peninsula University of Technology saying that it's long overdue. They welcome it based on a number of factors and grievances that they have, that of insourcing or outsourcing certain functions, militarizing the environment at university. Oliver, just your view in that regard to say, the rationale could be, because we're speculating, why Dr. Nzimande was sacked is because of his performance or lack thereof.
I think there's general consensus across the country at different spheres in education that Blade Nzimande was not fit for this position. The vice-chancellors in this country formed a vice-chancellors committee. They too felt that they didn't get the necessary support from higher education. And so it's clear Blade Nzimande was not fit for this position, but importantly, there was a political mismatch between the vision of institutions, the vision of students, versus the vision of the Ministry of Higher Education. And it was important to remove the Minister of Higher Education there, to replace him, one, with someone that can realign the political direction of institutions in South Africa. But importantly, I just want to go back to a question you previously asked. Is this a jab towards SACP, and does consensus mean everyone's happy? One, let's not be naive and assume that they were going to meet consensus. I can't imagine a situation where President Zuma sits around a table with Solima Paetla and as well as Kusatu and actually reach consensus when both the SACP and Kusatu in the last few months have vocalized their dissatisfaction with President Zuma. So they were just never going to reach consensus. However, the removal of Blade Nzimande doesn't mean that this is a jab at the SACP, because Nomvula Mokonyane is still well in her position, a very strong cadre of the SACP. Rob Davies, Jeremy Cronin, these are all people, Buti Manamela, who's now the Deputy Minister of Higher Education. These are SACP cadres who, one, have been put in strategic positions where where they're effective. Importantly, what we must notice about the higher education reshuffle is one that Professor Mkize over there, one is an academic herself, much closer to the understanding and the direction of academia in this country. But Buti Manamela is one of the youngest serving cabinet ministers under President Jacob Zuma. So it only makes sense to put Buti Manamela closer to the hearts and minds of young people in this country, and that's at the center of higher education. So I do think that higher education, one, is streamlined in that instance, where Buti Manamela is closer to understanding just what the plight in higher education is, and where that can be matched with the experience and intellect of Professor Hlengwele Mkhize. Yeah,
all right. Kim, just your reaction, especially now that Oliver has highlighted that there are other SACP members who, of course, on the ANC's ticket have been appointed as ministers, but they remain. The SACP bemoaning the fact that there is deadwood. There are ministers who should not even be MPs for that matter, but still are enjoying the perks of government. Is it on their part political expediency, trying to cry foul, or is there a legitimate concern there?
I don't think the concern is legitimate. And I think if we look at some of the positives of this cabinet reshuffle, we must commend our president for putting women at the forefront of cabinet posts. You know, if anyone has articulated the ANC policy on women emancipation, it's been him, and I think that's going to be part of the legacy that he leaves. In the same way, I think that he's fostering young people in the organization, and that is equally commendable. So I believe that what he's done in higher education is give us a perfect blend of wisdom with the cabinet minister and youthfulness with the deputy cabinet minister. And I think it's something that South Africa should be celebrating today, especially in view of some universities saying that they're going to put up their fees next year. So I can just urge this new leadership to really listen, to sit with students authentically and listen to their concerns, because they have not been listened to fully.
Yeah, but then again, the SACP being a very integral material stakeholder in the tripartite alliance, there's been many attempts in trying to find some cordial engagement and trying to restore the tripartite alliance to what it's intended to do. Today, they say they're now in uncharted water. They have never seen this before. In fact, it's now dilapidated escalated to a point of no return. Your view in where this is going, because they're not resigning en masse, as we heard from Solima Bail.
Yeah, I think we have a tendency in this country to romanticize the past and to think that the past will always be with us. The current president did, in closing the NGC of the ANC, assist members of the ANC to assist the possibility where the idea of the broad church will disappear. Where he said it is very important for COSATU to understand that the ANC is not COSATU. And the ANC's interests are much broader than COSATU's interest. And that the ANC is not the SACP. And there'll come a moment where the ANC and the SACP will say, guys, we have walked this path, now it's time to go our separate ways. So we need to appreciate that possibility, where the parties that have worked together will say it's time to part. But most importantly here, the SSP has always been threatening to go it alone. Actually, this is now beginning to sound like a stuck record. And some of us have actually said, it would be wise and it would be important for the SSCP to go it alone and to test this support that it claims to have. And so we are not surprised that we are hearing the same story. So if the alliance is broken, let it be broken and let the comrades part without destroying each other. But here, as my colleagues have also indicated, that they are also looking at the issue of performance in higher education. But I'm also looking at the relationship that has broken down between the president and the minister. And ministers are there to serve the interests of the president in terms of the president's agenda, an agenda that is set by the ANC. And if it comes to a situation where the two cannot work together, in the same way that we saw a relationship between President Zuma and Pravin Gordhan being broken beyond the possibility of it being repaired irreparably, it was necessary for the president to say, Mr. Gordhan, you may have been a wonderful person, but right now I think you have no respect for my office and you need to go.
So you're saying that the relevance of the SACP, if they were to forego the alliance, it would be left to their own evolution as to whether they survive politically or not, and that currently they're just making all of this ruckus in order to divide their lines further.
Let me tell you, under apartheid, there was clarity in terms of what the enemy is. When you listen to the SACP today, the enemy is Jacob Zuma. And when you go to the ANC and you ask what is the enemy today, they'll tell you that our challenge is poverty, inequality, and unemployment. So you can see these partners are not talking the same language. And when you're no longer talking the same language, it's best that you part and you pursue your own agenda. Those where Jacob Zuma is the agenda, let them pursue that agenda.
Can you
and
say,
the ANC must pursue its own agenda.
But would you say then Minister Nzimande undermined President Jacob Zuma in the imperatives that he highlighted around access to higher education, etc.? Or are you saying that the ministers don't have independence and that the president ought to micromanage? In other words, can't they make the prudent decisions to say, look, at this stage we can't afford what you'd requested. We're looking at it in the mid or long term?
Well, Cindy, I think the important thing is that the SACP and COSATU has undermined the alliance. Is there anyone who can blame the crisis in the alliance? The SACP mustn't now sit and say, oh, there's a crisis. They've created it. They have come with a false unity. If they are interested in unity, they all the time preach unity. If they are interested in unity, let them lift the ban on attending of meetings and addressing the gatherings of the SACP, of COSATU, and of the tripartite alliance that they have enforced on President Zuma. That is the kind of approach that we see that breaks this alliance. So if anyone is responsible for the breaking of the alliance, it is not President Zuma. It is Blade Nzimande, it is the SACP, and it is COSATU. Let them do introspection. If they're interested, and yes, I know that us in the ANC is interested in maintaining the alliance. If they are interested in maintaining the alliance, let them change their tune. Let them lift the ban. Let them work for unity and let them work for principled unity and let their ministers perform the duties that they have and implement radical economic transformation. It is a shame that a minister from the SACP, in fact, the leader of the SACP, did not implement radical economic transformation in his own ministry and caused the kind of crisis that we are faced with in education.
But the SACP and COSATU are not the only ones that have been critical of Jacob Zuma's administration, and some, saying that he has violated the constitution. There are many other controversies around the president, and therefore it would be best that he vacates his post. Professor Thomas Hausen, just in terms of the line in the sand being drawn, and largely the SACP saying that Zuma is squarely to blame for the breaking in relations with the tripartite alliance. Your view?
I don't think so. There's a lot of talk about the ANC splitting into a social democrat and a socialist faction. But the actual split that we're witnessing is a split in the SACP, where former ministers Pravin Gordhan, Hanekom, and now Bladen Zimande are what in the history of communist parties is called revisionists. They have adopted a social democratic, aggressively pro-capitalist policy in everything they do and say. So, on the other hand, Buti Manamela, who's a member of the Central Committee of the SACP, accepted his position as Deputy Minister of Higher Education. So obviously, the Central Committee of the SACP was fully aware of this cabinet reshuffle. Impossible that Comrade Buti would not have discussed it with him. And he is happy with his new position, replacing Bladen Zimande. So maybe there's a split looming in the communist movement in South Africa, and maybe that is healthy and good, so that that people can focus on their actual ideological positions, on their actual policy. We've seen a resurgence actually of younger cadres in this reshuffle, of people with enormous competence, people that hold a bachelor in psychology, in clinical psychology, of people. Our new energy minister, somebody who has a science, a master in biochemistry. These are competent people. And I'm actually very, very impressed with the choices that were made and the new blood that has been injected. It's, I think South Africa and the world have been waiting for this. We will not see an SACP destabilizing the country. Maybe some members in the SAPC will opt to continue supporting a destabilization policy. And in fact, the student unrest, where entire libraries were burned, while the minister was nowhere to be found. Nobody knew whether he was sleeping or whether he was in Saudi Arabia or whatever he was doing, while an entire library was burnt down with hundreds of millions of rands of damages. We hope that that destabilization will be a thing of the past.
All right, and Mr. Dixon, just in the reactions we've seen from members of parliament and community members, etc., in that this is probably the Jacob Zuma masterstroke in either emerging much stronger, especially in light of the December elective conference, or it could backfire. Your view in why it is necessary, perhaps, for the old guard to go? I mean, Bladen Zimande has been SACP leader for, 19 years? And that this is a good time to breed new blood.
The numbers are staggering. Out of the 12 or so members in the Portfolio Committee on Higher Education, only 2 are actual young people. Moses Mbata from the Economic Freedom Fighters and Hlomela Butwa from the Democratic Alliance. Other than that, there's absolutely no young people representing a young voice on a portfolio committee and within a ministry so important to the direction of this country's education, to the direction of this country's research output, as well as to the direction of this country's innovation and economy. So it's important that we have the voice of Buti Manamela in there, but specifically because Buti Manamela is the closest voice we have to a socialist movement as possible, one that cares about the redistribution, the reclamation and redistribution of wealth, supposedly, and one that understands the plight of poverty that scourges young people in the country today. So it's important to let go of the old guard in that instance. However, I don't think the old guard was let go of completely. I think a certain move for me in this cabinet reshuffle that I'm not entirely happy about is the move of David Mahlobo from state security to energy. I think David Mahlobo was entirely ineffective as the Minister of State Security, and I'm unconvinced he's going to be effective as the Minister of Energy. And I think perhaps a younger voice needed to be brought in there, specifically because the implication of energy is not one that, that is immediately felt today, but one that will be felt 20 years from now by our children, who will live with an energy system that, for instance, may not cater very well to them. So it was important to have a younger voice coming over there. So that's, I guess, President Jacob Zuma had to take a closer look into that particular move in the reshuffle, which I'm not entirely happy about. But whether or not, and I just want to go back to the conversation you had with Carl over there about who's to be blamed for the friction within the tripartite alliance. I think I disagree that the ANC has to take all of the blame, and I also disagree that the SACP and COSATU has to take all of the blame. I think there's a fair share of blame that needs to be redistributed, that needs to be distributed evenly amongst all parties over there, particularly because they were speaking past each other for the last 2 to 3 years. In fact, the last 2 cabinet reshuffles, the one where Pravin Gordhan got removed, but also the one where Des van Rooyen served as Minister of Finance for about 3 or so days, was unconsulted cabinet reshuffles, when the tradition has always been that even while the president performs his prerogative and is allowed to do that, the president has always consulted the top 6, has always consulted the NEC, and has always consulted tripartite alliance partners. In those 2 cabinet reshuffles, he did it, and I think that's where the friction really started to come from. So President Zuma became despondent and uncommunicative in those actions, and I think he needed to become, and I think that was President Jacob Zuma's blame towards that. I think the SAPC's blame towards that was deciding to make this a public spectacle that became irrevocable. And I think they need to really sit down and have a conversation.
Well, we don't know if that opportunity will still arise, Mr. Dixon, but please hold that thought. Professor Siep.
There's an issue that we must correct in terms of history. Number one, when Pravin was going to be released, the president did consult with the SACP.
Exactly.
The following day, the SACP, even before Pravin was removed, called a press conference. And the president actually felt that he thought he was talking to people in confidence when they themselves, they want to play to the gallery. So if you have people behave like that, you're not going to consult. As far as the ANC is concerned, Gwede Mantashe, as well as the deputy president and Zweli Mkhize did acknowledge that the president had consulted them on the matter of Pravin.
We'll come back to that debate. So that we must correct that history. All right, we appreciate the clarity. Sorry, we'll come back to that. And if you've just joined us, these are the affected ministries since the president announced his cabinet reshuffle. Former Home Affairs Minister Professor Hlengiwe Mkhize is now Minister of Higher Education. Ayanda Ndlondlo takes up the key position of Home Affairs Minister, whilst Mamloko Kubai is now Communications Minister. Long-term Minister David Mahlobo has been designated as Minister of Energy, and Advocate Bongani Thomas Bongo is the new Minister of State Security. Buti Manamela is now Deputy Minister of Higher Education. And we also listen in to some reactions since the announcement was made.
We really see no need for a cabinet reshuffle. There was no need when you consider that we've had one just a couple of months ago. And the reality is that cabinet reshuffle should be about serving the people. If this cabinet reshuffle was about serving the people, there are a number of people who would have formed part of it long time ago. So we think it will be an injustice to the people of South Africa if all of a sudden cabinet reshuffles have to be defined through personalities. This should be about the people. For us, we reject it on the grounds that the economy just doesn't need this. We went through a difficult cabinet reshuffle that shook the markets, and Treasury is still in transition. Another cabinet reshuffle was not really necessary. So, considering the fact that we are facing so many jobs that are being lost, that is really our big concern as the Federation. On the issues of the alliance, we don't think that the alliance will be defined by decisions that are not permanent. The issues of reshuffles and deployments are not permanent. Those issues have never defined the alliance. this alliance was actually put together by people long before there was state power. So we are not going to get to a point where we start to define the survival or the death of the alliance based on whether they are positions or not. The issue about us is about serving the people of South Africa, and we don't think this reshuffle is serving the people.
We knew that President Zuma would have, at some time, have to remove Minister Blade Nzimande, being the Secretary General of the South African Communist Party, and the South African Communist Party have been very, very critical of President Jacob Zuma's leadership. But we feel that these kinds of cabinet reshuffles don't do the economy any good. We've seen the rand falter against the dollar. And we just hope that there were no ulterior motives other than the fact that Blade Nzimande was becoming a thorn in the flesh for President Zuma.
Well, actually, I must confess that I'm not surprised that Minister Blade Nzimande has been kicked out, because a little earlier on, there was on social media, there was a statement circulating where he pointed out that he had been asked to give certificates to these youngsters of MKMVA, and that he had refused, and that he understood that as a result he was going to be kicked out of cabinet. So it seems that's what it amounts to. Well, it puts a feather on his cap, because he at least resisted corruption. Because to give people degrees, certificates when they are not, they have not actually qualified for them, would have been criminal.
With regard to this cabinet reshuffle, we must say as the National Freedom Party, there is absolutely no surprise. I think even Dr. Blade Nzimande saw the clouds turning around him, gathering around him, and he saw it coming. And he was very outspoken about it, that he was about to be removed from his portfolio, and indeed he was removed. He has been in a very controversial portfolio with so many issues. But of course, with regard to the other members that have been moved to other portfolios, there isn't much that they've done in their previous portfolios. They've been there for a short while, and one was hoping that they would have done some work, but seemingly they have now been removed, having not done so much, because they were there only for a stint.
Meanwhile, EFF leader Julius Malema has welcomed the axing of Blade Nzimande from cabinet. He says, and I quote, "Blade is about himself. He's been useless as a minister. There's nothing that he has done as a minister of education." He adds that Blade Nzimande must man up and come and join us in the streets, and the only thing that has changed for him is his tummy, end quote. Trust Juju there, just to break the ice, because I mean there's a lot of people that take these things very seriously, and I think politically in the space that we're in, it impacts on our livelihoods and across sectors. One could argue about the economy and the impact on the rand, etc. But let's just go to what Juju had said here, that materially your life would change, you know, from being a minister to just being an ordinary member of parliament.
Yeah, well, I think what is important about this submission by all parties, even opposition parties, is they come to one point, that the departure of Blade was expected. And secondly, there are some who are saying he was a non-performer. I think it should be one of the messages that the SACP must reflect on, rather than to take this posture of pretending that the person who has been removed here is a messiah and was a solution to the country's problem. But what has always been, when you begin to dare people, as they have tended to dare people, is to say, if you are so unhappy in the leadership of Jacob Zuma, why do you want to continue to stay and be led by somebody you despise? And interestingly, when that question comes, you hear them come up with another explanation why they should actually remain in the cabinet. And actually, strangely, I agree with that view, because I think having multiplicity of perspectives in the cabinet that helps. But where the problem comes is when people fail to forget, where they forget one thing, the constitutional responsibility of individual and collective responsibility and accountability.
Okay, let's go to another allegation which is quite serious. We heard from Mosiwa Lekota of COPE saying that actually then Minister Blade Nzimande had subverted possible corruption from the MKMVA League, or the young people wanting to have a certification that they did not sit for or deserve?
I've heard this nonsense. There's never been any intention or any request from the side of MKMVA for qualifications that our comrades don't have to be given. So let us put this out of the way. I do not want to get involved in a SACP bashing session, but at the same time, I want to agree with Professor Seepe that the SACP, in the manner that it has conducted itself, has actually behaved in a way that they want to have their cake and eat it. On the one hand, they want to criticize. On the one hand, they want to say that there are certain ministers who are non-performers, when one of the biggest non-performers is in their own ranks. When that non-performer is removed, then it is suddenly unacceptable. Then suddenly we must try and keep him in his position. The SACP cannot be in a situation where they want to criticize the president, where they want to place themselves to some extent outside of government, and at the same time they want to say in because they like what they have as ministers and because they want to continue to ride like a flea on the back of the elephant.
But they have a point in that there's deadwood, as they say, other ministers who are underperforming or not even performing, that the president could have sacked in the interest of having a more competent and qualified people to get there.
Let them then be consistent. And let them also acknowledge in their assessment then of performance or underperformance, the underperformance of their own leader. Let us not be selective in how we handle these issues. If you want to criticize, yes, it's fine, criticize. But use a yardstick that you apply to everyone, not just to those who you consider to be your political opponents.
Okay, but if Zuma is stamping his authority, and constitutionally he is permitted to do so, he also runs the risk of creating further divisions, not only in the SACP and the ANC. Was this something that was inevitable, that he could not have avoided or waited for another opportunity?
Well, I think at these times, decisive leadership is very critical. And what I find very interesting is how the media have jumped to certain speculations. There's a flurry of conspiracy theories. And I wonder why we don't give the president the benefit of the doubt, that he has made these changes on the basis of good governance, on performance of the incumbents. And yet we don't do that. I wrote an article a while ago to say even if the president saved a drowning child from drowning, we would still paint him as the villain. And I think we must be very careful about making judgment calls like that. As far as the SACP is concerned, I do hope they stay in the alliance, but perhaps they can take a lesson from something that I heard from the Dr. Dlamini Zuma's campaign, where she said even if she doesn't win in December, she will commit herself to this party. And I think if there ever was a time for the alliance partners to stand by this alliance, rather than marching in the street with reactionary oppressors, this is it. So I hope they look beyond the personal and look at the long-term longevity of the ANC and commit to the spirit of radical economic transformation, which is what they should be doing at this point.
Professor Thomas Hausen, do you see that happening with the SACP, particularly Blade Nzimande humbling himself and wanting to be a servant leader, to boost and unite the ANC?
Difficult to speculate. There's ample room. There's a lot to do in South Africa. Energy Ministry, for instance, the consequence was a very embarrassing defeat in court over a period of 4 years. That ministry didn't manage to follow the process of preparing an important tender, a tender for our nuclear energy option, which is part of the BRICS policy. China this year is commissioning 36 new nuclear plants. India is commissioning latest generation nuclear plants. Brazil is even producing nuclear fuel. So within the BRICS, we are expected to cooperate, and that ministry has failed. It has made so many formal mistakes that it was thrown out of court. So it is good that Mhlobo, who has a steady hand, who has a lot of experience as an administrator in the Department of Water Affairs, that he should take over and get that ministry to perform again. It is about performance. And of course, Blade Nzimande, Pravin Gordhan, Hanekom, many other comrades who now have opted to follow a social democratic line suddenly. They are welcome to contribute. They're welcome. There are so many fora in Parliament and outside Parliament to contribute to the biggest challenges in this country, which are the very, very low levels of education. Our education output is amongst the lowest in the world. And it is our energy crisis which is making the growth of the economy basically impossible. So these are ample spheres where everyone can contribute and participate. You don't have to be a minister to participate and to contribute ideas.
All right, Mr. Dixon, in your view, has President Zuma gone out of his way to make permanent enemies in the political space and, you know, I suppose in the public discourse? Or are we looking at a career politician, an astute leader who has the interests of this country at heart?
Depending on how you want to look at it, Zuma is as strong as he was yesterday or is as weak as he was yesterday. I don't think this reshuffle has gained him any new enemies. I think the people who are disgruntled with this reshuffle were people who were disgruntled with Zuma yesterday, last week, or last year. So I don't think he gained any favor or lost any favor because of this reshuffle. So importantly, however, is I think we really need to ask ourselves, look, cabinet reshuffles happen for one of two reasons. One, to drive efficiencies, or two, to change the policy direction of certain portfolios, certain ministries. And here we have to ask ourselves, is there a policy redirection that President Jacob Zuma is preparing the country for or has set his cabinet up to head towards? Or is it just about driving efficiencies? At this stage, I guess, we would entirely be speculative if we were to comment much on that, given that President Jacob Zuma hasn't yet given us reasons for this cabinet reshuffle. Hopefully, he will give us some, and maybe we can then understand it much clearer in terms of what the motive and was behind this reshuffle. But so far, we've been able to ascertain that in certain instances, it was certainly to realign the views of certain sectors of society. For instance, students in higher education needed a ear that listens much closer, and that is the ear of Prof. Mkhize as well as Buti Manamela. But in a different instance, it's Ayanda Dlodlo, who's now the Minister in Communications. Home Affairs, excuse me, coming from the Ministry of Communication. A very effective minister, one that is known for cleaning up institutions. And I think it's important that we have her in the Ministry of Home Affairs, given one, just how much inefficiencies lie with regards to border regulation and the cracking through of undocumented foreign nationals. And I think it's important, one, to clean up at least that part of Home Affairs. And I think Minister Ayanda Dlodlo will be doing a fantastic job in that. In other instances, again, and this is where I really want to disagree, I'm unconvinced David Mahlobo is a good administrator. I think he leaves much to question, just especially how he treated the whole Fees Must Fall protest, where he invited certain Fees Must Fall protesters and figureheads to his personal home when that should not have been the case, and when he was unable to account for that quite directly in a portfolio committee meeting in Parliament, where he denied it at first and then conceded to it at some point later. So that leaves a bitter taste in the mouth of a lot of people, and I guess this is an opportunity for him to prove his detractors.
All right. Just let's get a perspective from our panelists. Of course, the what do you call the character in question with regards to David Mahlobo not being truthful or economical with the truth. Just the controversy around that in itself. I mean, we've seen newspaper headlines around this is another leeway, if you will, of the nuclear deal that is going to benefit Zuma and his cronies?
Well, I think, first of all, it's always interesting how we select one issue, and that defines the person's portfolio. The meeting with a student leader is not his portfolio. His portfolio is bigger than that. And it's a portfolio that most of us are not even privy to, because you are dealing with intelligence. And intelligence requires that we do not know certain things. So I don't think we can actually begin to judge what he does, because the only person who can do that would be the president. Because among other things, we are an a country that has a lot of international relations. And the role of ministers of intelligence is also to provide the president with that information. So we are not very clear about that. But what is important, and this is what Professor Thomas Hausen was trying to raise, that those of us who know Mahlobo only as a Minister of State Security have a limited knowledge of him. He actually mentioned that this is a person who has been more in the water, but also that this is also a person who is a trained scientist. His background is more in the sciences. So you would argue that if he moves into energy, he moves into the area of specialization that he knows something about. But I don't think we should take one instance and then that should define everything. And that also applies to Blade Nzimande. We should not take one instance of failure and say that means that he has actually failed. We must look at the entirety. And I think we hope that when the president looked at this, he was looking at a number of issues. But also, cabinet reshuffles, as Dixon was saying, it's also true, it's about efficiencies, but also it's also about politics. As Kim was saying, that sometimes when you are a leader and you realize that there are people who are not playing along, you actually exit those people. You make sure that
but I want to come back here. But the basic irrefutable attributes of a leader is the ability to speak the truth, even if it's to answer simple questions. We're not going to dwell on it, but I think people are allowed to have their own suspicions or being circumspect of what's happened with the latest cabinet reshuffle. But put us at ease, Kim, in your political analysis expertise, that this is not just a knee-jerk reaction because the president's ego is dented or that he has a personal score to settle.
I'm not sure why that theme is coming through so clearly, or perhaps we're just getting used to this anti-President Zuma narrative. I don't think such decisions are taken lightly. I think he's shown a great commitment to the radical economic transformation, and I think he's gearing up and reinventing and re-energizing critical portfolios to drive that as fully as he can. I think he wants that to be part of his legacy, and I'm taking the higher road on this, and I believe his intentions are honorable.
I also think that we shouldn't forget about Professor Lindiwe Mkhize, because she is a highly competent academic. And we must not forget that she was already as a deputy minister in the Ministry of Higher Education, so she's got a strong record there. And if there's someone in the current crop of ministers, without bringing in someone from the outside, that can do this job, it is indeed her. So I think the president has taken very careful decisions. Yes, of course, politics plays a role. And it will always play a role in a cabinet because it's a political institution. But at the end of the day, what we have seen here in the Ministry of Home Affairs, in the Ministry of Higher Education, also I think in the Ministry of Minerals and everywhere else, is that there is a minister who is being putting there who can do the job and who has got the qualifications. And that is a wonderful combination, good politics and at the same time the right qualifications.
All right, thank you so much to all our guests for this evening. Kim Heller's political commentator, Oliver Dixon, social political analyst, the Carl Niehaus, MKMVA NEC member, Professor Sipho Siepe, political analyst, and Professor Andre Thomas-Hausen, constitutional law expert. And you at home, our most valued panelists, thank you indeed for tuning in. We take an ad break and do stay with us. Up next, ANC Decides with Mfundo Mabalane.